Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every human soul when the fire of suffering becomes the forge of transformation. In the harrowing theater of narcissistic abuse, the empath, the deeply feeling, intuitive soul, is not merely wounded. They are summoned to descend into the depths of their own unconscious, to confront the shadow, and to re-emerge not as a victim, not as a savior, but as an integrated, sovereign being. This is not a story of heartbreak. It is the journey of psychic alchemy. Today, I speak not only to those who have endured the manipulations of the narcissist, but to those who are ready to awaken to the final stage of their metamorphosis. In the beginning, there is enchantment. The empath, attuned to energies beneath the surface, often perceives connection in places where others see only coincidence. When they meet the narcissist, it feels like recognition, like a soul remembering another across time. There is a magnetic pull, an uncanny sense of familiarity. The narcissist, in turn, appears as the perfect complement, confident where the empath is cautious, assertive where the empath is reflective, alluring in a way that bypasses reason, and appeals directly to something ancient within the psyche. This meeting, however, is not a union of equals. It is the unconscious seeking itself in disguise. The empath projects the best of their unclaimed light onto the narcissist, seeing strength where there is only control, depth where there is only manipulation, and love where there is only need. And yet, this illusion is not foolishness, it is archetypal. It is the psyche attempting to reconcile its opposites through projection. The narcissist, too, plays a role not by accident but by necessity. They are not simply villains. They are mirrors of what the empath has yet to claim within. The narcissist's false self speaks to the empath's disowned ambition, repressed anger, or forgotten self-worth. The relationship becomes a sacred stage, one that reenacts ancient patterns woven from childhood wounds and ancestral conditioning, and the empath, deeply invested in the story, commits to the role of the healer, the fixer, the one who believes they can love the broken back into wholeness. They give more, they forgive more, they rationalize, they endure, and in this endurance they begin to disappear from themselves, layer by layer, sacrifice by sacrifice. At first, the empath doesn't see the cost. The charm is still intact, the promises still echo, the mask of the narcissist remains convincing, their stories still inspire sympathy, their pain seems genuine. The empath's natural compassion becomes the very fuel that feeds the dynamic. They excuse behaviors, minimize red flags, and doubt their own instincts. The narcissist, skilled in projection and distortion, ensures that the empath begins to internalize blame. Maybe I'm too sensitive, the empath thinks. Maybe I misunderstood. Slowly, the ground beneath their feet becomes unstable, truth bends, emotions are used as weapons, praise is given and withdrawn like a drug. The empath, once intuitive and secure, becomes anxious, confused, and desperate for the return of the person they fell in love with, not realizing that person never truly existed. This is the moment the illusion begins to crack, though the empath may fight to preserve it. They cling to the image not out of ignorance but out of hope. Hope that love can conquer distortion. Hope that if they just do enough, give enough, prove enough, they can restore the connection. But the more they try, the more the narcissist punishes. Affection becomes conditional, approval is rationed, reality is denied. The empath starts to see that the rules are always changing, that vulnerability is punished, that empathy is exploited. The mask begins to slip. The narcissist, no longer able to maintain their facade under the weight of the empath's emotional clarity, reveals their true self not in words, but in actions. It is in this unveiling that the empath faces a devastating realization. The person they thought they knew was a construct, a carefully curated performance designed to extract supply, not offer love. Everything the empath gave, the patience, the tenderness, the loyalty, was not seen, appreciated, or reciprocated, but consumed. The illusion crumbles, and with it the empath's sense of identity, purpose, and reality is called into question. It is not just heartbreak, it is ego death. the collapse is total emotional, psychological, spiritual, and yet, within this collapse lies the first invitation to awakening. For only when the illusion shatters can the truth begin to emerge, not the truth of who the narcissist is, but the truth of who the empath has been all along, buried beneath their own projections, hidden beneath their need to be needed, silenced beneath the weight of their own denial. After the collapse, silence rushes in, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that confronts. The empath, once consumed by the noise of managing the narcissist's moods, explaining away contradictions, and salvaging the relationship's illusion, is now left with only themselves. What was once devotion now feels like debris. The mind circles in loops, revisiting conversations, revising memories, searching for the moment when everything started to turn. But the spiral does not lead to clarity. It leads inward, into a dark forest with no clear path, only the ache of disorientation and the quiet question echoing louder with each passing day. Who was I before I made myself so small for someone else? This is not merely heartbreak. It is descent, a psychic plunge into what was long repressed or unacknowledged. No longer distracted by the drama of the narcissist, the empath begins to feel the weight of their own emotional inheritance. Patterns emerge, not just from this relationship, but from others before it. A parent who withdrew affection unless perfection was performed, a sibling who shamed sensitivity, a society that praised self-sacrifice and labeled boundaries as cruelty. The empath begins to see that the pull toward the narcissist was not only about love, but about a familiar wound. It was a reenactment, a subconscious attempt to master pain by revisiting its source in disguise. The narcissist triggered the wound, yes, but the wound existed long before. And now, stripped of distraction, the empath is asked to confront it. This confrontation is not intellectual. It is emotional, cellular, ancestral. Memories once buried begin to rise, not in linear sequences but in sensations. Tightness in the chest, nausea without cause, tears without language. The body becomes the storyteller. The empath learns that healing will not come from blaming the narcissist alone, but from reclaiming the parts of themselves they had to abandon in order to survive here. In the shadow, the empath meets their own unintegrated self. Not just the loving, intuitive parts, but the angry parts, the selfish parts, the boundary, enforcing parts that had been locked away in the name of being good. These parts are not wrong, they are not shameful. They are necessary, but they were exiled long ago to keep others comfortable. Now they return, not as invaders but as messengers, and the empath must decide whether to reject them again or begin the long work of integration. This descent is solitary. Friends may not understand, therapists may offer frameworks, but the real work cannot be done through advice. It must be lived. The empath, once oriented around the needs and moods of others, must now learn to sit with their own rage, grief, shame, and desire without judgment. The temptation to bypass is strong. To forgive prematurely, to rationalize, to label everything a lesson and move on. But real healing requires the courage to feel what was once unfelt, to grieve not only the loss of the narcissist, but the loss of innocence, the loss of years spent trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. It is in this rawness that the empath begins to see their own complexity. They were never just victims, just givers, just healers. They were also complicit in their own suppression, participating in dynamics that echoed old stories they had never questioned. This is not self-blame, it is self-responsibility. The realization is devastating and liberating, for in seeing how deeply they abandoned themselves, the empath discovers the power to return. And the return is not to who they were before the narcissist. That self was already fragmented. The return is to something deeper, more whole, more real. A self that does not seek worth through service. A self that does not confuse love with absorption. A self that does not need to be chosen to feel valid. The descent, then, becomes initiation. Not through rituals imposed from the outside, but through the inner confrontation with truth. The empath, no longer trying to be good, becomes real. And in becoming real, they begin to remember that wholeness is not perfection, but integration. Not light without darkness, but light shaped by the wisdom of having survived the dark without turning away. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when the empath stops asking why the narcissist did what they did, and begins to ask why they themselves allowed it to continue for so long. This shift is not born from self-blame, but from the stirring of something long dormant, awareness. After the storm of confusion and pain, after the descent into the shadow where grief, rage, and buried truths revealed themselves, a quiet strength begins to emerge. The empath, who once bent endlessly to accommodate the needs, moods, and manipulations of another, begins to sense the edges of their own being again. For the first time in what feels like forever, there is space, not filled with chaos or longing, but with potential. And in that space, a question takes form. Who am I when I am not performing love for someone who cannot receive it? This is the beginning of reclamation. It does not come all at once, and it is not accompanied by certainty or applause. It begins in small moments. The refusal to answer a call that once triggered panic. The realization that silence is not absence but sanctuary. The decision to listen to one's own discomfort instead of suppressing it for the sake of keeping the peace. These moments are subtle, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but they mark the turning of the tide. The empath starts to realize that their intuition, once doubted and overridden in the presence of the narcissist, was never broken, it was ignored. Now, it becomes the compass, slowly regaining its voice as the empath rebuilds from within. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls designed to keep love out, but bridges that define the terms under which love can exist. For so long, they gave without limits, mistaking unconditional love for self-erasure. Now they see that real love includes the self, honors it, protects it. The empath no longer seeks to be understood by those who distort their truth. Instead, they begin to understand themselves, not as someone who failed to save the narcissist, but as someone who abandoned themselves in the process of trying. That recognition is painful, but it is also liberating because it means that power can be reclaimed not from others, but from within the voice of the inner child, once silenced beneath layers of self-denial and caretaking, begins to emerge. It asks not for perfection, not for control, but for presence. It asks to be seen, heard, and protected by the adult self, who is now capable of offering what others could not. The empath realizes that self-love is not a mantra, but a series of choices, sometimes hard, sometimes lonely, always necessary. They begin to speak truth even when their voice shakes. They begin to trust their instincts even when others disagree. They begin to honor their limits, even when guilt threatens to pull them back into old patterns. This reclamation is not a return to who they were before the abuse. It is a becoming. The empath who emerges from this stage is not naive, not desperate to fix, not defined by their ability to absorb pain. They are discerning, they are grounded. They understand that compassion without clarity becomes self-destruction, that empathy without discernment becomes entrapment. They know now that it is not cruel to walk away from what harms them. It is sacred. They no longer romanticize potential. They respond to reality. They do not explain their worth. They embody it. Their relationships begin to shift. Some fall away, unable to meet this new version of them. Others deepen, now that the empath no longer gives from depletion but from fullness. The energy that was once spent managing someone else's chaos is redirected inward, into creativity, purpose, and alignment. They learn to hold space for themselves, to validate their own experience, to choose peace over patterns. And in doing so, they step into a new way of being, not as someone who seeks completion in another, but as someone who finally remembers that they were never incomplete to begin with eventually, after the fire has burned through the illusions, after the silence has revealed what noise had hidden. The empath steps into a space that feels unfamiliar not because it is new, but because it is unfiltered, untouched by the need to please, perform, or prove. What once felt like emptiness is now recognized as presence. What once felt like loneliness is now understood as sacred solitude. The empath is no longer rushing to fill the void with validation, no longer seeking out people to rescue, fix, or understand them, because something has shifted at the core, a quiet knowing that the healing is no longer about them, the narcissist, or even the past, but about who the empath is now becoming. The past has served its brutal purpose, cracking open the shell of false identity, and now there is room for the authentic self to emerge. This emergence is not loud or theatrical. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or declarations. It unfolds slowly, like dawn, almost imperceptibly at first. The empath begins to notice that they are no longer triggered by the same things. They don't explain themselves to people who misunderstand them. They don't chase after closure from those who benefit from keeping the story open. They no longer enter conversations seeking to be convinced they are worthy. They arrive already knowing it. The hypervigilance that once guarded them from emotional harm begins to dissolve, replaced by a grounded sense of self that does not need to control everything to feel safe. And because of that, they stop fearing themselves. The empath becomes a different kind of observer, still intuitive, still deeply feeling, but now able to discern between compassion and compromise. They recognize manipulation before it takes root. They sense misalignment and no longer rationalize it. They listen not only to what is said, but to what is not said, the pauses, the patterns, the energetic weight behind words. This ability, once used to navigate dysfunction, is now harnessed as wisdom. The empath has become a kind of healer, not in the performative sense of fixing others, but in the embodied sense of having healed themselves so deeply that their presence alone shifts the room. They speak less but mean more. They give less, but it reaches deeper. Their energy no longer leaks into every open wound around them. It becomes contained, intentional, sacred. Where they once felt drained after being around others, now they know how to protect their field, how to leave situations that dishonor their peace without apology or explanation. They recognize the beauty of being selective, not from judgment but from clarity. The connections they choose now are rooted in reciprocity, not desperation. They no longer romanticize intensity. They seek consistency. They no longer confuse chaos with passion. They know that safety can also be electric. When the nervous system is no longer addicted to adrenaline, disguised as love, there's a quiet power in this stage. A kind of sovereignty that isn't interested in revenge or vindication. The empath doesn't need to be seen by those who once ignored them. They don't need the narcissist to understand what they've done. The empath understands that healing doesn't require an apology, it requires release. And so they let go. Not because they don't remember, but because they finally do. They remember who they were before the conditioning, before the roles, before the pain. And more importantly, they now know who they are without it. This is not the empath turned cold or hardened. This is not a cynical version of someone who once gave too much. This is the empath refined, sharpened, whole. Their empathy has not diminished, it has matured, it is no longer compulsive, it is conscious. It does not seek to merge, it seeks to meet. They don't lose themselves in others, they stand beside them, sovereign and present. They have learned that to truly love one must be rooted in the self, and that no one can meet them fully until they have met themselves entirely. The empath is no longer the mirror. They are the flame, and only those who can walk with fire will remain. The journey of the empath through narcissistic abuse is not merely a story of trauma, it is a mythic path of transformation. It is the hero's journey through the underworld of the psyche, culminating in the return to self. To those who walk this path, you are not broken, you are not too sensitive, you are not foolish for having loved. You are becoming whole, and when you reach the final stage, you will understand not through thought, but through being that the narcissist was never your mirror. Your true reflection was waiting beyond the pain. Beyond the collapse, beyond the shadow, it was always you.